funny to see so many people on the main floor and no one in the balcony. I remember.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Hi. Welcome to the June meeting of the Carter Center Board of Councilors. I'm Mary Moore, past chair of the board, and filling in today for Laura Seidel. I want to welcome our online viewers and about 150 people in our day chapel. We're coming back cautiously from COVID, and we thank all of you for joining us. We have several new BOC members with us today and many guests. First, we always welcome members of Atlanta's diplomatic community. Please stand, and we'll hold applause for the entire group. We welcome Consul General of Ireland, Caoimhe Ní Chruair, Consul General of Canada, Ambassador James Hill, Consul General of the Netherlands, Jaap Veerman, His Majesty's Consul General of the United Kingdom, Ambassador Rachel Galloway, Consul General of Switzerland, Urs Brinnemann, and joining us for the first time, we welcome Consul General of Brazil, Ambassador Luis Santos. Welcome to Atlanta. Thank you. We also welcome Consul General of Japan, Mio Maeda. Honorary Consul of Senegal, Julius Coles, and Honorary Consul of Cyprus, Polly Potter. Have I missed any consuls in the room? Welcome, consuls. I want to welcome two groups among our guests today, and I'll ask them to stand. First, the Atlanta Area Lions Clubs, led by Atlanta Lions President Becky Jarrell. Welcome, Lions. Also, more than 70 summer associates and interns from our Atlanta legal, accounting, and consulting firms join us today as guests of BOC members. Would you all please stand? We hope you enjoy your stay in Atlanta, and we hope that you stay connected to the Carter Center. Several members brought guests today, too many to introduce individually, but all of their names appear in your meeting packet. Let me now ask all of our guests to stand and be welcomed. Welcome, guests. As I mentioned, a number of new members join us today, and we're delighted to have them as BOC colleague members. However, I'm going to hold off introducing them and let BOC Chair Laura Seidel have the honor of announcing the entire class of 2023 at our meeting in September. Now, let me ask all BOC members, new, old, current, or retired, to rise and receive a round of applause. Thank you, counselors. Just two items of board business today. First, let me draw your attention to our schedule of the BOC meetings for 2023, which is in your packet, and particularly our next meeting on Friday, September 22nd. At this annual meeting of the Board of Councilors, we will celebrate our 36th anniversary, and we will invite all former BOC members, as well as spouses, colleagues, and other guests to join us. Second, more than 755 people have served on BOC since 1987. Unfortunately, many of them have passed. Of note, two members, both very important to the Carter Center, recently passed. Jim Balloon of McKinsey & Company, and then National Service Industries, who led one of the first pro bono strategic reviews of the fledgling Carter Center in the early 1990s, and later served as BOC chair. And Oz Nelson, a dear friend to many here, an absolute civic titan since 1991 when he brought UPS to Atlanta, a co-founder of the CDC Foundation, and longtime trustee and chair of the Carter Center. Our condolences to their families. Now, on to our program. First, Ben Spears, Associate Director of the Conflict Resolution Program, will report on the situation in Sudan. Next, Dr. Greg Nolan, Director of the River Blindness Program, will explain the achievement of being able to stop treatment for the disease in 4 states in Nigeria. Then, Yawei Liu, Senior Advisor for the Center's China Focus, will give an update on relations between the United States and China. After these presentations, we'll hear from Carter Center CEO, Paige Alexander, who will take remarks and questions. So, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker. Ben Spears, Associate Director with the Conflict Resolution Program, started as a graduate research assistant with the Carter Center's Democracy Program in 2013. Before joining the staff of the Carter Center in 2016, Mr. Spears managed field operations for multiple political campaigns, coordinated outreach for Congressman John Lewis, and directed programs for Ultimate Peace, a peer-to-peer sports initiative in the Middle East. He earned his bachelor's degree in international development at George Washington University and a master's in public administration at Georgia State University's Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. Ben?
Thanks. Well, good morning. Thank you, Mary, for the introduction. Good morning, Board of Councilors, Carter Center staff, interns, special guests. As Mary said, I'm Ben Spears, Associate Director with the Carter Center's Conflict Resolution Program. I've been told with this sign that I have about 4.5 hours to speak, so I'm going to take my time. I'm going to give you all the detail you want to hear about Sudan. I was here actually 8 months ago speaking about the situation in Sudan, telling you about the potential of the Carter Center's work with Sudanese youth and civil society to bring impact in Sudan. I'm going to share with you how that potential has become real. I'm also going to share with you the flip side. Developments recently in Sudan have been awful. And so I'm going to give an overview of that, a little bit of how the Carter Center has experienced it, and how the youth that we work with have responded. Allow me to start with a quick moment of silence to acknowledge a lot of the suffering, loss, but also the resilience evident in Sudan. Thanks. Y'all heard from me in November about President and Mrs. Carter's and the Carter Center's long-term commitment to peace and to health in Sudan. The commitment remains. In fact, the Carter Center and President Carter are best known for their work to support Sudan's Federal Ministry of Health in eradicating guinea worm. And except for the WHO World Health Organization certification, that mission has been accomplished, which is incredible. President Carter himself has been involved in many efforts to negotiate peace agreements between Sudanese and also between Sudan and its neighbors. But there are long-standing grievances in Sudan. In fact, Sudan has been plagued by this cycle of military rule, popular revolution, a temporary democratic government, and then a military coup. Several of Sudan's military or armed organizations have been politicized, and a lot of that effect is being felt today. There's also been an over-centralization of government. There's been kind of a legacy of extractive industries in Sudan that take from the peripheries, don't give back, and over-centralize in Khartoum, the capital. And so it's these decades of civil war that the Carter Center's peace programs have seen. We're trying to learn from and work with Sudanese youth and civil society on changing. And in fact, Sudanese youth rose up in 2018 and 2019 and led a popular revolution to overthrow 30-year President Omar al-Bashir. The transitional period hasn't been smooth, but there was a path towards democratization and peace, largely led by youth who are a majority in Sudan, but they've been excluded from some of these processes. Let me pause there. In the revolutionary period, the Carter Center has gotten engaged in really, really positive ways. We've worked with Sudanese youth to strengthen their role in transitional and political processes. In fact, Paige Alexander in 2020, in the heat, it seemed, of the pandemic, signed a memorandum of understanding with then Federal Minister of Youth to help the Carter Center bridge the gap between us and civil society in Sudan, and to help them build a cohesive network across what is otherwise a fairly fragmented civil society. I'm going to define a few things, and I want to talk today about the Sudan Youth Citizen Observer Network. So what is youth? We're defining youth really as anyone under age 35, most of the folks that the Carter Center is working with are between 18 or 21 and 35 and have a university degree, to give them an idea of some of the methods we're going to use. And then we trained observers in early 2021 on survey methodology and more recently on independent observation. And this observation looks like noticing, conducting independent interviews, working with people in the network of civil society in Sudan, and sharing what's happening in the communities that they know very well with a central secretariat. And that secretariat compiles information, drafts reports, and publicizes them. In Arabic and English, I'll mention. But let me say, Sudan's political situation was severely interrupted a couple of months ago by the outbreak of violence between two armed actors, both with affiliations to the former President Bashir and some national legitimacy now, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. I should be changing my slides, but I'm not. The Sudanese Armed Forces and Rapid Support Forces have different histories, but I just want to acknowledge that they're both state militias. Each of them has different ideological backgrounds, and they've been pressured, it seems, by the security sector reform agenda, which is an important agenda, but by the security sector reform agenda to merge into one organization. That merger wasn't smooth. In fact, that merger is part of the pressure cooker that led to the leaders of these two military groups to go at each other. So on April 15th, there was an outbreak of, I will say, a full military campaign. A civil war apparently is defined as when people in countries fight each other. I would define this as state militias fighting each other rather than people. We're fortunate at this point, Sudanese communities have not been totally wrapped up in the same violence that the Rapid Support Forces and Sudanese Armed Forces have been engaged in. The shooting, the bombing, the destruction of property and people has had major impacts in Sudan. Most of you have surely heard of this. More than 1 million have left Sudan. Several million have moved within Sudan. Among those people are Carter Center staff, partners, contractors. And so as people who follow the situation in Sudan and are in daily contact with Sudanese people, it's had a real impact on the life and livelihood of Sudanese people and the people that the Carter Center is connected to. One of the phrases I learned recently about the effect on civilians is a negative coping strategy. Many in Sudan right now have such poor access to the basics of life that they are engaging in negative coping strategies, and it's really scary. It's a scary situation. But civil society and youth have responded, and that's what I'm here to celebrate today. So following April 15th and the outbreak of violence, the Carter Center-supported Youth Citizen Observer Network got engaged. This is about 75 young people who themselves and their families are affected by the violence, began daily remote phone calls, issued an immediate condemnation of the violence, and deployed observers in communities to conduct interviews, submit reports on some of the key matters right now in Sudan: humanitarian access, availability of basic supplies, the observation of ceasefires, which, by the way, have been brokered but largely not been observed in Sudan. They're noting restriction of movement, health system needs, some of the economic breakdown happening in their communities. And the youth are being recognized globally. More than 60,000 people viewed the Youth Citizen Observer Network's first report on adherence to the ceasefire via Twitter, which is incredible. BBC World Service 10 days ago interviewed the Secretary General of the Youth Citizen Observer Network for their program. And I think it's the founder of the Sudanese Doctors for Human Rights said, quote, "This is the only effort to document ceasefire breaches in Sudan." And so in an environment like the one that Sudan is facing, this is an area where people can gain independent information based on local observation. And the Carter Center is supporting those youth doing the observation. So now you know why I asked for a moment of silence. It's a really difficult period in Sudan. But there's incredible resilience seen by Sudanese youth, supported by the Carter Center. When I was here in November, as I said, the Youth Citizen Observer Network had great potential. We've since done training, we've since done mentoring, we continue to support on a regular basis youth and Sudanese civil society. The Carter Center's investments in youth are paying off in Sudan. And I hope that the next time I brief the Board of Councilors, the national situation will be better. I know that we're contributing to that potential future. Last couple of things while I have the microphone. I want to take the opportunity to thank a few staff and Carter Center partners. There are many in Sudan, too many to name. Here in the room, Brandy Blue, Signe Meyer, and also others on my staff, Lauren Daly. They do incredible work, and I wanted to share that. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about Sudan, and I wish you a pleasant day. And I'm going to scroll through my slides before I finish. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. It's good to know I'm almost still a youth. I'm 35. In 2020, Dr. Gregory Nolan was named director of the Carter Center's River Blindness Elimination Program, the Lymphatic Filariasis Elimination Program, and the Schistosomiasis Control Program, as well as the center's Hispaniola Initiative. Dr. Nolan joined the Carter Center in 2011 as an epidemiologist for the center's malaria control program. Before that, he worked as a project manager for a University of Minnesota malaria research program in Kenya, and prior to that was a guest researcher at the CDC's Division of Parasitic Diseases. Greg earned his bachelor's degree from Davidson College. He earned a doctoral degree in molecular microbiology and immunology from Johns Hopkins University's Bloomberg School of Public Health, and he earned a master's of public health degree in global epidemiology from the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory. Dr. Nolan?
Well, thank you, Mary, for that introduction. I know being chair has many challenges, but pronouncing all those diseases is certainly among the top. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us this morning. 21 years ago, a group of public health experts convened in this very room to consider the feasibility of eliminating a disease called onchocerciasis. This was spurred in part by the enthusiasm and momentum of having eliminated smallpox, the first and so far today only human disease that has been eliminated, meaning no diseases globally across the entire face of the earth. That achievement was achieved in 1980, and in the decades that followed, in part led by the International Task Force for Disease Eradication, which is hosted at the Carter Center, groups of public health experts convened to scan the horizons and see what other diseases might be eligible, might be amenable for elimination and potentially even global eradication. So this group of experts convened in the year 2002 in this room to consider the feasibility of onchocerciasis elimination. So onchocerciasis, also known as river blindness, is a parasitic disease that affects the skin and also the eyes, potentially leading to permanent blindness. And it's transmitted by small black flies of a particular genus that breed only in rapidly flowing rivers, well-oxygenated rivers with rapids. And so due to that association with rivers, the disease, of course, acquired the name river blindness. There are approximately 240 million people globally at risk for onchocerciasis, river blindness, a number of countries in the Americas, a small foci in Yemen, but really 99% of high transmission occurs on the continent of Africa. This classic image reminds us that river blindness and other diseases of blindness affect not only an individual with that disease, but also entire families, entire communities. There are numerous reports that in vast, fertile areas next to and along irrigated rivers and well-flowing rivers were abandoned due to the presence of biting flies and high levels of blindness within those communities. This image reminds us again that often someone from within a family is asked to care for someone who has lost their sight. In many cases, that ends up being young children who may one day be forced to make a very difficult decision between continuing to care for that family member and then, or potentially going to school. And so these are hard challenges that people in endemic areas have to face on a day-to-day basis. But there's treatment. So the drug ivermectin, produced by Merck, is effective at treating this disease. And in fact, 1987, Merck made the unprecedented decision to donate this drug for free for as long as needed for the global initiative to eliminate onchocerciasis. This drug, while it is effective at treating larval parasites that are found in the skin and thus blocking transmission to flies and breaking that entire transmission cycle, the drug doesn't completely kill the adult worms that are found in nodules within the skin. And so at-risk communities are given this drug on a repeated basis, generally annually, but for up to 15 years, which is the lifespan of that adult worm. And that's a process we call mass drug administration, where an entire community is treated. So coming back to the 2002 conference on eradicability, what was the conclusion? Well, at that time, the conference concluded that river blindness was, at that time, not eradicable using the current tools that we had. And that was primarily due to the overwhelming intensity of transmission in Africa. But President Carter has always reminded us that if we have tools available today, we should use those to end human suffering. And so for World NTD Day a few years ago, he pointed this emphasis on using the tools we have today for onchocerciasis and the other neglected tropical diseases that the Carter Center fights. So in 1996, the Carter Center established a river blindness elimination program. This is the former and founding director of the program, Dr. Frank Richards, in Jos, Nigeria, standing with colleagues. And the river blindness elimination program started at that time providing assistance to several countries in Africa and also to the countries at risk in the Americas. And so, starting first with just a quick status update on the situation in the Americas, we're incredibly proud to have helped 4 out of the 6 at-risk countries in the Americas to achieve WHO verification of having eliminated river blindness, namely Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, and Ecuador. And in fact, 94% of the originally at-risk population in the Americas has been reduced. And there's now only a small group of individuals, the indigenous tribes of the Yanomami, who reside deep in the Amazon jungle in the border area between Brazil and Venezuela, who remain at risk and continue to be treated for this disease. So great celebration, great progress in the Americas. But what about in Africa? So a Carter Center principle has always been, go to the hardest places first. Those will take the longest, and those, therefore, you may as well start while you have the time. So Nigeria. So for the rest of this, the few minutes I have, I really want to focus on our progress in Nigeria, which along with Democratic Republic of Congo is the most endemic country in Africa. More than 50 million people in Nigeria, or 1 out of every 4 Nigerians, is at risk for river blindness. Baseline mapping indicated that essentially every single state in Nigeria was endemic for this disease. And so the Carter Center, we continued to provide support for 9 of the 36 states in Nigeria. Those are the states circled in dark blue on this map. Other partners provide similar assistance to those other states. So don't feel like there's a state uncovered in Nigeria. We just are working collaboratively with other partners in Nigeria to eliminate this disease. Since 1996, the Carter Center has assisted with more than 244 million treatments for river blindness. We've trained more than 200,000 village-level community drug distributors who offer treatment to their fellow villagers on an annual or semi-annual basis. That's done through a process, again, called mass drug administration. And for distribution of this drug ivermectin, you can see it's distributed on a dosing schedule, generally by height. And so you can see this woman is holding a dose pole. So small children under a certain height are not treated. Taller individuals are given 1 tablet. Even taller individuals are given 2 tablets, and so on. And so this is really the way we dose for this disease, to eliminate the disease. And so after decades, again, recall the lifespan of this worm is more than 15 years, and so this takes a long time to interrupt transmission in these communities. But we are starting to see the progress of decades of investment. So beginning in 2017, Plateau and Nasarawa State were the first 2 states in Nigeria to interrupt transmission of this disease. Again, important to highlight, these are Carter Center assisted states. This was done through a process of meeting WHO criteria of testing more than 3,000 individuals per state. So in total, these surveys, we tested more than 6,000 children in total for evidence of infection. There was none. We collected and tested more than 19,000 black flies for evidence of infection. There was none. Then, progressively over the years, other states also reached similar milestones. So, Kaduna State, 2018. Several other states in 2021, including Carter Center-assisted Delta State in the southeast. You noticed a color change for Plateau and Nasarawa. Those 2 states completed what's called a 3-year period of post-treatment surveillance to determine whether the disease may come back. It didn't. So the Ministry of Health in Nigeria was able to officially endorse those states of having eliminated the disease. Again, the first 2 states in Nigeria to have done so. And then last year, an additional 4 Carter Center-assisted states in the southeast of Nigeria eliminated transmission for up to 19 million people in those 4 states. So this was a global record to date, meeting eligibility criteria to stop MDA for this many people, 19 million people. So in January of this year, on World Neglected Tropical Disease Day, the Federal Ministry of Health endorsed the halting of treatment in these 4 states. Carter Center was able to amplify this message along with our other partners. Again, just highlighting, this is the biggest news in the onchocerciasis world for decades, reaching these milestones and finally achieving success against this disease when we didn't think it was possible. And so with this update, I really just want to leave you with that message, that we are achieving success. We continue to work to achieve full elimination of this disease in Carter Center-assisted areas of Nigeria and across the entire state, the entire country, along with our other partners, and of course in the other countries where we assist. So again, achieving what we didn't think was possible. It's an incredible testament to the work of those who started the program, to those who work in the field to distribute these medicines, and of course those who support the program. And so I thank all of you. I heard the announcement this morning from the Lions Club's representatives this morning. Lions Clubs have been an incredible donor to partner for the program for many, many years. So we thank the Lions Club and the others who support the program. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nolan. It's an incredible update on the progress. Next, we have Dr. Yawei Liu. He joined the Carter Center in 1998 as director for the China Village Elections Project and now serves as senior advisor on China. Dr. Liu is an expert on U.S.-China relations and Chinese grassroots democracy and is an adjunct professor of political science at Emory University. He has been a member of several Carter Center election observation missions to China and Latin America. He earned his master's in history from the University of Hawaii and his doctorate in U.S. diplomatic history from Emory University. Dr. Liu.
Good morning. I feel a little bit empty now because our leader, the giant, is not here physically. Since I joined the Carter Center almost 25 years ago, I came to numerous BOC meetings, and he's always here. But I also feel very energetic and vibrant because clearly his spirit is not only with us, Greg and Ben and all the summer associates, from the community, his vision is still with us. And it is incumbent upon us, to carry that forward. So what I want to share with you today is President Carter's special relationship with China, the courage of President Carter in making the momentous decision to normalize relationship with China, the Carter Center engagement with China in the past 3 decades, and finally, what the China Focus is doing right now in waging peace between these two countries. I want to contextualize this epic story by saying, since President Nixon's trip to China in February 1972, when I was only 12 years old, and since President Carter made the decision to normalize the relationship on December the 15th, 1978, I was a college freshman, this relationship between US and China is at the lowest point. It is no longer unthinkable that a war, whether intentional or by accident, between the two countries. So here, as you can see, so US and China have issues in the South China Sea, East China Sea, but most importantly is in the Taiwan Strait. President Biden 4 times since he became the president saying if China is going to use force against Taiwan, US men and women will be intervening on the ground, unlike what US is doing now in the Ukraine-Russian conflict. So the 2 pictures over here is last week, while all the military leaders are meeting in Singapore, a US-Canadian joint naval fleet sailed through the Taiwan Strait. Right in the middle of it, a Chinese warship cut in front of a US destroyer. If you look at the picture, the distance between the 2 ships was only 150 yards. That's what we're talking about by accident. Now, President Carter had a very special relationship. I guess, his relationship with China is different from all the other American leaders. Number one, he shared the same birthday with the People's Republic of China. He always said the largest number of people on the face of the earth is celebrating my birthday. That's October the 1st. Only that he was 25 years older than the People's Republic of China. Secondly, he heard about China from the devoted Baptist missionaries. So he started donating nickels, dimes, and quarters to the missionaries so that they could set up hospitals and schools and universities in China. Thirdly, the biggest influence on him about China is his uncle, Tom Gordy, who is a merchant marine who was stationed in China, who wrote to him every month about what's going on in China. And that inspired President Carter to try to go to Naval Academy to study because he wanted to go to China. And he realized his dream of going to China in 1949. He was a submariner, and for the first time, he saw real China in the city called Qingdao and also Shanghai. So he saw the abject poverty in China. He saw the brutal civil war in China. He also saw the rise of the Chinese Communist Party in China. And so that's his special relationship. Now, Nixon did go to China in February 1972, but Nixon was never able to normalize the relationship. It was more difficult for a Democratic president here in the US to establish the relationship. But President Carter was determined to do it while he was in the White House. Of course, he wanted to bring China into the American fight against the Soviet Union. But more importantly, he felt it was even more important to bring China into the global community. So when he made that decision, he negotiated with his good friend, Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping, and the announcement was made. So right after that announcement was made on December the 15th, 1978, George H.W. Bush, who was U.S. first representative to China before the relationship was normalized, wrote an op-ed in Washington Post saying it is unchristian for President Carter to sell out over 20 million people on the island of Taiwan. Ronald Reagan already declared he was going to run for president in 1980, and he said if elected, he is going to abolish that decision. And Barry Goldwater, the senator, actually filed a lawsuit saying by normalizing relationship with China, President Carter violated his constitutional authority. But of course, he didn't. At the same time, China's biggest meeting to launch reform and opening up was only 3 days later. So normalizing relationship is China suddenly became a normal country in the global community. At the same time, China became a normal country, allowing its people to make money, to get rich. So these two decisions were the engine of China's prosperity and the size of the economy today. So right after relationship was established on January the 1st, 1979, President Carter invited Deng Xiaoping to visit. And for the first time, I was a sophomore in college. We saw the real America on 9-inch black and white TV, and we suddenly realized we were misled by the propaganda, because we all believed when we were in elementary school, middle school, high school, and college that this country was so corrupt, so decadent, that it is going to decline. And then we saw Deng, the grandeur, the spectacle, and he's coming here to Atlanta, to Houston, to Seattle, to Washington, D.C., that this is the country probably no other country can really rival with. And so the whole lie suddenly collapsed. And I want to call your attention to one of the pictures at the bottom. You see Richard Nixon over there. This is his first return to Washington, D.C. after he left in disgrace during the Watergate. And that also shows, President Carter, nonpartisan side of it. He always acknowledged and he's grateful that Nixon was the first one that went to China. But of course, the myth is, at least from the China side, it's all Nixon and Kissinger. President Carter is irrelevant. And we all need to work together to debunk that myth. We need to claim the height of US-China relationship. Now, President Carter was never able to go to China while he was in the White House. And Deng Xiaoping basically told him, visit us whenever you want to. And President Carter and Dr. Hardeman made multiple trips to China. And during one of the trips, President Carter asked Deng Xiaoping, is there anything that the Carter Center could do in China? And Deng Xiaoping basically said, it's in the middle of this slide, that's his son, who is paralyzed from waist down. He was pushed out of the window in a university during the Cultural Revolution. He was running China's National Association for the Disabled People. And the Carter Center started working with this association in the early 1990s. I still remember right in this room is my first engagement with the Carter Center. Was an interpreter when the Carter Center was training special ed teachers. I think 60 of them were here. I was doing the interpretation. Forgot what I translated, maybe it's all wrong, but that's Carter Center's first engagement. And then there was the German production line of artificial limbs. But later, we were invited by the Chinese government to observe election. President Carter, as you see on this slide, observed a village election in September 2001. I think Dr. Hardeman was with him. This is outside Shanghai. And now, of course, since that time, 1998 all the way to about 2012, the Carter Center was intimately involved in promoting political reform in China. So our signature website is a Chinese language website called China Elections and Governance. And people in China, they all know about this website, but they didn't really know that this website is actually a Carter Center product because it's in Chinese. It was blocked in 2012, in April 2012, but we managed to keep this website alive. Even today, it was maintained by volunteers, and we still try to promote political reform. So on this slide, you also see President Carter building homes for Habitat in Humanity in China after the earthquake in that province in 2008. President Carter visited his counterpart, former Chinese president, hometown, because both of them were carpenters. And finally, President Carter speaking in 2009 when we were commemorating the 30th anniversary of the normalization of US-China relations. Now, of course, Xi Jinping came to power in October 2012. China's relationship with the world has been altered since that point. China's domestic politics have been interrupted since that point. Our relationship with China was also changed after he came to power. That meeting, Dr. Hardeman was in the meeting. We were not allowed to get into that meeting in which President Xi Jinping told President Carter, no more domestic stuff. You normalize the relationship, so focus more of your energy, use more of the resources of the Carter Center to build up the bilateral relationship, to improve mutual understanding. So from that point on, we launched a bilingual website called the U.S.-China Perception Monitor. We started convening. Every time the meeting was held here, we call that Jimmy Carter Forum on U.S.-China relations. It was in this room. You can see the picture, President Carter with the Chinese ambassador and his loyal, trusted national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. That was in October 2013. And we spent a lot of years, Ben was talking about Africa, to promote US-China collaboration in Africa. So the bottom two pictures of this slide, one is, on the right, is our meeting in Djibouti. American officials, Chinese officials, African officials. Djibouti is where China had its first military base. And on the left is the African attaches, American military attaches, and Chinese military officers meeting in Beijing. For the first time, we brought African people to China. So we've been working on that. So currently, China Focus engaged in 3 initiatives. So number one, as I mentioned, we launched the websites in 2015 in both Chinese language and English, and you can see the number of views. In 2022, because of the pandemic, we're organizing virtual events. We had a total of 41 in 2022. And also, you see the contents at our English website are cited widely by the mainstream media outlets, by Foreign Affairs, by diplomats, and by all the other journals. And finally, we're also conducting public opinion survey on the experiment basis. As you can see, we did one to see how China's position is shared by the people in China regarding Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. We also issued Carter Center report on U.S.-China relations. So the most 2 recent report is the role of higher education. I'm a beneficiary of higher education. I was able to come here to study, and there are hundreds and thousands of people like me who are now working here in the U.S. The second report is the role of high technology. This is where U.S. and China are decoupling. The next report is going to be on Taiwan. I mentioned how dangerous the Taiwan Strait is. We hear a lot of American noise in terms of one China is going to use force. We hear a lot of Chinese noise saying it's easy to take over Taiwan. In a matter of hours, we'll be able to overwhelm Taiwan. In this cacophony of noises, we don't hear any voice from Taiwan. What's their aspiration? What do they want to see? So I'm going to Taiwan next week, and we're going to release that report later this year or early next year. We probably will have an in-person event here. We'll invite you all to attend that. And finally, we will launch a public opinion survey in terms of how China sees the U.S. and how Chinese people sees U.S.-China relationship. We want to do that on a regular basis. It's challenging, but we are determined we're going to do it, and probably the first wave will be launched later this year or early next year. As I mentioned, we have had 7 Jimmy Carter forums on U.S.-China relations. This was the last one in January 2019. Right here in this room, if you look at the picture on the right, President Carter looking at that picture of him and Deng Xiaoping, and I'm certainly confident that he said I look a lot younger back then, in 1979. So it is very crucial for us to take stock of what happened in the last 45 years, and particularly the last 6 years. It is important to examine how the decision made by President Carter and Deng Xiaoping have changed the U.S., China, and the world for the better. But it is more important to look for a new framework, a new paradigm, not only to stabilize this relationship, which is totally out of control at this moment, but also to make it possible for the two countries to compete responsibly, to coexist peacefully, and also to cooperatively confront global challenges. President Carter worked with 4 generations of Chinese leaders from 1977 all the way to early last year. His last message to the Chinese people was a New Year message in January 2022. So he has been engaged, and now it's incumbent upon us to sustain that legacy. We're going to work with the Chinese people, we're going to work with the American people, we're going to keep the people-to-people diplomacy alive, and we are, as Paige has recently agreed, we're going to convene our next Jimmy Carter Forum, the 8th Jimmy Carter Forum, in January, here in this very room, 2024, basically to look at President Carter's legacy, to look at what we can do to stabilize this relationship, to wage peace between these two countries so the whole world, people of both countries, can benefit from this consequential, but at the same time, very volatile relationship. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. And a big thanks to all of our speakers for the timely and such important updates on the work that they're doing on behalf of the Carter Center. It's really impressive. Thank you. Now, for remarks and questions, I'm pleased to introduce the Chief Executive Officer of the Carter Center, Paige Alexander. Paige.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to my colleagues. I was sitting here listening and realizing, Yahweh, as you were talking, there's this wonderful story about President Carter getting a call when he was President Carter, I think from Zbigniew Brzezinski, saying that the Chinese want to send X number of students over, and President Carter's response was, why not make it Y number? Do you remember what those numbers were?
Well, the question is, what about 5,000? And President Carter said, why not send 100,000 and slam the phone? Because
yeah.
The phone call came at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Exactly. So, I mean, that was indicative of that relationship as it was starting, and the picture that you saw, 2 other elements of that. The picture you saw of the work that we were doing with disabled youth, and that was because President Carter was asked. It wasn't because he came in and said, as we talk about white saviorism, this is what I'm going to do. He listened to what was asked for on the ground, and that was the program that we ran at the time. Also, given the political polarization, I think it was wonderful that he invited President Nixon back to the White House for that meeting, and it reminded me of President Reagan inviting President Carter to greet the Iran hostages. Now, we now know through new press stories that perhaps there might have been some guilt on President Reagan's part and his staff's part as to why President Carter was brought back in. But it's just indicative of sort of a time that was and how it mirrors where we are now. And then for Greg's presentation on Sudan, Greg, Ben, and I were all in Sudan together during what we thought was this wonderful launch of the lymphatic filariasis program and river blindness program. We flew down to White Nile because, again, we were asked by the government to look at LF and RB and river blindness in that area. And so we were starting to launch a program there, which obviously has been usurped by the current situation that Ben talked about in Sudan. And Ben's comment about looking at the youth, it reminded me that some of you might remember in 2011, 2012, there was a presidential candidate who was talking about having a binder full of women because you have to bring the right people to the table. And this is sort of where we are. There was just an article in The Economist, and we wrote a letter to the editor afterwards because part of solving some of these solutions in countries are about bringing the right people to the table. And President Carter always knew that. And the continuation of our programs is very much based on the fact that we know there are other people that need to be at the table. And in this case, it's the youth. And I think that's going to be what makes the difference. So all of these presentations were wonderful, and they really, surprisingly, strung together the base of what we are about here at the Carter Center and the work we do. And for the summer associates who I'm thrilled are here, you know, as you're contemplating what does Atlanta bring to the mix and how international is Atlanta, I think that this gives you an idea of programs that are run just here at the Carter Center. There are lots of other organizations in town, but this is the legacy of having a former president who grew up in a small town 2.5 hours south in Plains, Georgia, and came to the world stage and recognized the rest of the world is very much like his own village. And so Atlanta, not really a village anymore, but the reality is his legacy lives on with the programs that we're running. And so thank you to all of my colleagues for your presentations. And I do hope people will ask questions because there's a lot there, and a lot of our staff that has, well, been called out have worked really hard on these programs. Mary, thank you for coming back. Really appreciate you stepping in for Laura, which means that I get to do some of the conversations that normally Mary used to do in terms of what the Board of Councilors is. I just want to remind everyone that the Board of Councilors, and those of you who are here, it's Carter Center's outreach to the Atlanta business community and the Atlanta community writ large. We want to have you all talk about the work that we do in your circle of influences, which are different than our own circles. As you can see, even though my colleagues sort of underplayed the work we do, that was the way President Carter always wanted it. We were out in the field, we were doing the work, we weren't taking a lot of time to chest thump. And so it's people like you who actually bring our message to the community wider. And this conversation is why we want to make sure people know that our 37 acres are open. We're here. The picture that you saw of President Carter with Richard Nixon, that you can see that in the library, because that is actually his carryover from his time, as I know Lauren Kent Delaney told our summer associates, as President Carter used to say when he was retired from the White House. This is what he carried on, and this is what he and Mrs. Carter continued to do. I want to also mention that we have Carter Center Weekend. It's our annual fundraiser. This year we're doing it in Atlanta, and so I think the Board of Councilors members have all gotten invitations. It's June 21st through 25th at the Lowe's Hotel, and there's a special invitation for auction night, which you will be hearing about. I will mention that this, on top of the work that happened with river blindness and lymphatic filariasis, and river blindness in particular in Nasarawa and Plateau in Nigeria, we also last month were able to declare Mali has eliminated trachoma, another blinding eye disease that we work on, and that has eliminated as a public health threat, and that's significant movement for Carter Center and for our government partners in Mali. And these things happen like monthly. I am always surprised at the good news that comes out, and that I, as a normal individual, would not necessarily have heard about. But that's the work we do, because when we started in the 90s, we continued because we went to the hardest places first, and now we're starting to see some of these successes, including guinea worm, which many of you have heard about, and sometimes I hear in pop culture. And I was watching a Netflix series, and they mentioned like a sitcom, and they mentioned guinea worm and the eradication of guinea worms. Like, who would have talked about that? Well, in 1986, in 21 countries, there were 3.5 million cases a year. And last year, we're down to 13 human cases in the world. So this is what happens when you dig deep and you continue along something without thinking, this is a moment in time, we're going to solve an Afghanistan problem and an Iraq problem. We're actually going to really hard places and staying there for a long time and having those partnerships. I would be wrong not to mention the outpouring of support that we've had for Mrs. Carter this week. As a co-founder of the Carter Center, the work that Rosalynn Carter did on mental health is something that started over 50 years ago. In 1970, she greeted President Carter actually in one of his campaign stops. She was on the rope line, and she said, "What are you going to do about mental health and the people who are suffering?" And he said, "I'm going to put the best person I know in charge of it." And that started her career on mental health. And so the fact that, as she always talks about, caregiving and mental health and how they're inextricably linked, if you get in the car going home after this, you will probably hear on Political Rewind, I just did a program with Jennifer Olson from the Rosalynn Carter Institute of Caregiving, which is based in South Georgia, as well as a Rosalynn Carter Mental Health Journalism Fellowship recipient from GPB, who we actually have funded this because we know talking about mental health is so important, getting out in the press, having journalists talk about it to destigmatize it. That had always been what Mrs. Carter wanted. Destigmatize it and increase and raise awareness and the ability to treat it. And so her public announcement is very precious to us because it starts the conversations at the dinner table, it starts the conversations in the doctor's office, and it starts the conversations among all of us who I am sure have somebody either in our family or who we know who is going through a mental health crisis. Now, the illness that's related to dementia is quite different in many ways, but it is still the crisis that the U.S. is facing right now, and especially post-COVID with our youth. So having this conversation has been a really important part, and I'm glad that she was willing to put it out there and that the family was willing to put it out there. So thank you for all your good wishes on that. And I think with that, I am happy to take questions. There are microphones. I'm also happy to make sure, and RK, of course, would you mind going to the microphone, or I can repeat your question if you don't want to walk up there, but also questions for the panel, because I don't have Jason here to sort of say, Jason's going to take questions now, so it's me.
First of all, I'm glad Jason is not here.
You're glad he's not here?
So you can fill in for him. And I don't know where they found you, but I think you're doing an excellent job.
Thank you, RK. Thank you. Well, being a native Atlantan, I was found here, but as my mom likes to say, I spent 35 years visiting other places before I came home. So I'm home now. Thanks.
I'm so glad that you asked this question because we actually contracted a Toronto-based Canadian company to conduct a public opinion survey, and it's called RIWI, R-I-W-I. They have a patented technology. It takes too long to explain, but we'll put this in the report. So we used the company to test run that survey, and it actually, I think once it came out last year, it gained a lot of traction, is that over 70% of the Chinese people felt that it's NATO, it's the US that really caused the Russian invasion. And that public opinion is important, even though to a certain extent, we call that artificial, because the propaganda is such, anything that is contrary to that official position is censored. And that's why the leaders can always say there is a public opinion, but our responsibility is actually to go after that public opinion and say there are other voices there, and we need to make that voice heard. And day in, day out, our Chinese language website are being censored by the Chinese. Our big US-China Perception Monitor language website was blocked in March last year, as soon as we put out an article by a Chinese scholar to criticize the Chinese government position on the war in Ukraine. And then we had to put out another Chinese language website. We have to play this game, and now we're looking at technologies, hopefully that we can really breach the Great Firewall so that information can flow into China. Thanks.
And just on that, Yahweh had said the last communication President Carter had with China was New Year's greetings, but in fact, he did have a communication where we talked to China about their stance on Ukraine. So that was a follow-up that I had a conversation with him, and even though he's fully retired, I thought your voice still carries a lot of weight, and so if you wanted to send a message to Chinese leadership saying, we have a question about why you're not coming out stronger against Russia. And so we did have those conversations, but again, these things are all done quite quietly. Yes?
DK, so quick question for Ben. You spoke to the ideological, or kind of speak a little bit to the ideological differences with the militias in Sudanese. Are they religious-based? What are the differences?
Thanks for your question, RKT, sorry. The ideological background, it's not homogenous. It's important to say that the Sudanese Armed Forces, the so-called regular army in Sudan, there are credible reports that it's been infiltrated, and really the history of it is itself colored by the Sudanese government's collaboration with radical extremists and Islamist-leaning groups. So Omar al-Bashir had a 30-year rule that was both military inclined but also Islamist leaning. And so SAF is definitely infiltrated by this Islamist leaning. The Rapid Support Forces, RSF, has less, I would say, of an ideological leaning. It does have an ethnic component to it, largely because the leader of it comes from an ethnic group that itself was almost exclusively funded in their suppression of Darfuri groups in the early 2000s. And so that ethnic component carries to today. There are other economic elements of both groups. They get their funding from different sources. Gold is largely the funding source for the Rapid Support Forces in relationship with, we understand, Russian Wagner Group elements and also others in the Gulf. The Sudanese Armed Forces is in collaboration with other regional and international players that doesn't necessarily have an ideological component but may have a financial or economic one. So it's ideological, it's economic, and there are analysts who say basically the surviving organization in this pressure cooker of RSF, SAF battle is the one that will be able to finance itself. So the sort of, that's the harsh reality, is that they're fighting for survival, and it's largely an economic battle at this point. To the destruction of Khartoum and other parts of Sudan.
And following up on what Ben said with that as well, I think that, just to brag on Ben for a moment, when we were in Sudan, we had an outreach to the former Sudanese ambassador to, actually, I'm thinking of South Sudan now. I'm getting my countries confused. With Ding Ding?
We've both been there this year.
Yeah, I was about to say, that was a different trip. The former ambassador from South Sudan to a Gulf country, and he happened to be in Juba while we were there, and so Ben was in contact with him, and we sat down with him because the reality is, I've worked a lot in the Middle East, and so many of these countries are proxy wars. You don't necessarily expect that with Sudan and South Sudan, that these are going to be proxy wars, but the reality is the role that money plays in both of these militaries and who is going to be able to finance themselves, it actually might come down to who's got the most money tucked away where. And so it was interesting for us to be able to have that conversation with an ambassador who had been part of our guinea worm program in Abu Dhabi, and Ben knew him, and then we were able to talk to him about the role South Sudan might be able to play in this current problem in Sudan. So that, again, this is where health, democracy, peace, and our contacts in the political sphere actually all overlap. And that was a priceless moment, I thought, and really helpful because Ben had him on text. So thanks.
Hi, Paige. I wonder if you could give us maybe 5 minutes of what the Summer Associates will be doing. And I ask in part because years ago, I had the opportunity to go way behind what at the time was the wall and I got to spend 2 summers in programs, and it changed my life. Can you give us a feel for that?
Sure. Well, a couple of things. One, they're the summer associates who have joined us in the back, but they're associated with law firms here. And so this is an opportunity for them to hear a little bit more about an organization in Atlanta that does things that are more global. We do have our interns. I see some of them up there, and unfortunately, Lauren Kent Delaney's up there, so I can't like throw you the microphone. But we had the largest class of summer intern applications here at the Carter Center this year with over 500. Yep, with over 500, and we have 30 summer interns this summer, and they're here in a 10-week program. We, with Lauren Kent Delaney's excellent leadership, we pay our summer interns this year. We started about 3 years ago when I came in and realized that when people come to be an intern at the Carter Center, often, well, we weren't paying them, but they were able to do Tai Chi in the Peace Pavilion with Mrs. Carter, and that was kind of a benefit to be able to talk about that. I mean, I literally was in Washington and ran into Jake Tapper, who was talking about being an intern here during the summer, and seeing President and Mrs. Carter walking through, holding hands on their way down to the exercise bike in the in the basement. So people have strong memories, but now I think, unless, to be honest, everyone's going to look like my kids that can come and do a summer internship and have it not be paid, we need a different field and a different pool feeding into the Carter Center. So we've got 30 summer interns, and they are spread between our peace divisions, our health divisions, and our operations, whether it's communication, development. I don't think finance took anyone. And this is an opportunity for them to spend 10 weeks doing things. Post-COVID, getting interns out to the field has not been something that we've been able to do a lot of. I think one has been to Colombia, Venezuela. I think we've had a couple in Latin America. But it is a great opportunity, and I think you're right, it is life-changing. My experience on my first overseas trip, I remember, really led me to international development, because before that, I wanted to be a summer intern coordinator at Kilpatrick Townsend, where Cindy Beecham had done it, and I thought, wow, this is like being Julie McCoy on the Love Boat. You get to plan baseball trips and all the great things that the summer associates at law firms do. Fortunately, I had a different experience and decided I would go a different way, but it does make me realize the importance of any summer internship program, whether it's with a law firm or whether it's with an organization, a nonprofit organization, is an opportunity to have an experience and to figure out what you want to do and what you don't want to do. And so we wanted to make sure we talked to the legal summer interns about what the Carter Center offers, because we always need pro bono help, so there's always that. But also our summer interns have an opportunity to see a lot of the programs that we work on. So thank you. I encourage anyone who has applicants, I think it closes next week for the fall session. Lauren's saying yes. And Lauren Kent Delaney, who's been with us for 17 years, is retiring, so you won't have her to knock around anymore in terms of, but I'll be here, and so you can always contact me and let us know. So, other questions? It's a quiet group this morning. You get up so early at 7:30 in the morning. Okay, one more question?
Humberto Garcia Huergrim. It's a personal question, but I think your answer, Dr. Liu, will shed some light for everyone in this room on sort of the situation. I have a 17-year-old son, Diego, who's studying Chinese at the Atlanta International School, who's going to Taiwan next week for 3 weeks to live with a family. Given the warships in the Straits, should I be worried as a parent?
No, I don't think you should be worried at this moment. As I mentioned, the American noise is these generals, when they testify in Congress, they always say, 2027, China is going to launch the war. I think the closest is from the Air Mobility Command, who said the war is going to break out in 2025, because January next year, Taiwan is going to elect possibly a very anti-China president who is going to pursue Taiwan independence. But on the China side, I think they understand, going to war, what that means to China. So even though a lot of people think President Xi is very abrasive. You know, he wanted to see the unification under his watch, but to take China to war means, you know, I talk about the 45 years, you know, the whole dividends of reform and opening up, they will go down the drain if China goes to war. So I think leaders on both sides, particularly in Beijing, they are going to think this through. And the war in Ukraine certainly is going to make them a lot more reluctant to go down that road.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Emery Morsberger, and I have two jobs. My night job is helping Ukraine, and I want to thank you for all of the work that you're doing there. My day job is managing the area of Norcross that includes Jimmy Carter Boulevard. This road was named in 1976, 2 weeks after Jimmy Carter was elected. And there was never a connection between the road and the president. 3 weeks ago, we were honored to have Ambassador Young and Jason Carter come and speak on Jimmy Carter Boulevard about Jimmy Carter the man. And it was a grand slam home run. I want to thank the Carter Center for supporting us on that effort. We actually live streamed it to Plains, and I think he enjoyed it. And it actually it exceeded all expectations. We got over 900 million exposures worldwide. The interest level in how President Carter and Mrs. Carter are doing is just huge, and it's worldwide. It was an outpouring of love, the likes of which we've never seen before, and I thank you.
Well, thank you. I think Jason did a wonderful job, and I laugh. I wish he was here, but he would understand if I said this. President and Mrs. Carter really don't like his beard, and Mrs. Carter, last time she saw him, she's like, have you just lost your razor entirely? And so because it was, after the hospice announcement, he shaved. And so he was walking around without a beard, which I had never seen him without a beard, and he looks like a very young person without the beard. And he decided to grow it back. And so when he was on that, he was like, oh, they're going to see this and realize I grew the beard back. So that was, his takeaway was how proud he was, but also my grandparents are going to see the beard again. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was incredible.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so with that, if there are no other questions, I encourage you to stay and mingle and talk. Thank you so much for being here today. Before I close, I want to remind you of 4 items. If you're able to visit longer, we have a second coffee in the Ivan Allen lobby until 9:45, so you can grab another nosh. Also, the Jimmy Carter Library. Oh, am I supposed to be doing this, or you're supposed to be doing that? I was like, suddenly something's running on screen. I'm going to have Mary come up and do it. I've talked enough. So thank you. I was like, I don't think I was supposed to do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Paige. We're so fortunate you did not become Julie, the next cruise director. It's great. Thank you. Before I close, I want to remind you of 4 items. If you're able to visit a bit longer, we have a second coffee in the Ivan Allen lobby. Another second coffee until 9:45. And also the Jimmy Carter Library and Museum invites members and guests to a self-guided tour of the Presidential Museum. Volunteers can guide you there when you exit the chapel. And I just want to say, I visited recently. My cousin and her wife were in town, and it was really incredible. So I hope you'll take the time to go there. She also served in the Army under President Carter when he was Commander-in-Chief, so it was very special. I look forward to seeing you at the next annual meeting of the Board of Councilors celebrating 36 years of BOC. That's on Friday, September 22nd, 2023. And remember that the Board of Councilors asks only 2 things of its members: that we attend meetings and that we proactively support the center in those circles in which we have influence. Tell someone today about the important work going on here at the Carter Center. Thank you and have a great summer.